Captain Eva Rostova's arrival at Forward Operating Base Kestrel was as quiet as the dust that settled on everything. She stepped off the Osprey, a single duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her form indistinct in the shimmering heat. The base was an angry anthill of activity, a temporary scar carved into the ochre landscape of a forgotten valley. Marines, lean and burned brown by the sun, moved with the aggressive economy of men who lived on the edge of a knife. They saw her, of course. A new officer was always a curiosity, but the single silver bar on her collar and the logistics branch insignia were enough to warrant a quick dismissal. She was a loggy, a bean counter, another body to fill a rotation in the S4 supply depot. Her boots made no sound on the gravel path leading to the command tent. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, sweat, and the low hum of overworked electronics. Colonel Marcus Thorne looked up from a tactical map, his eyes, the color of faded fatigues, sweeping over her with an impatience that bordered on contempt. He was a man forged in the crucible of infantry command, a leader who believed battles were won with fire, maneuver, and the iron will of his grunts. He had no time for the bureaucratic machinery that supported them. "Captain Rostova, reporting as ordered, sir," she said. Her voice was level, without inflection. Thorne grunted, a sound of pure acknowledgement, devoid of welcome. He gestured vaguely toward the sprawling supply depot on the far side of the FOB. "Find Captain Jensen over at the S4. He'll get you squared away. Try not to lose any of my bullets." It wasn't a joke. It was a dismissal, a clear and concise summary of her perceived value. She was the custodian of things, not a wielder of them. Rostova gave a short, correct nod. "Aye, sir." She turned and walked out, leaving no more impression on the command tent than a shadow passing the door. The real conflict wasn't with the insurgents hiding in the crags of the surrounding mountains. It was here, in the casual disdain of a system that judged a book by its cover and a soldier by their branch insignia. A group of Marines, lounging near the mess tent, watched her pass. One of them, a sergeant with a cruel smirk and the swagger of a man who'd seen just enough combat to feel invincible, nudged his friend. He intended to tear a patch from her vest, a small act of territorial dominance. The moment was coming, a turning point she could feel in the air, as tangible as the grit between her teeth. But it wasn't time yet. First, she had to learn the terrain. The daily briefing was Colonel Thorne's sanctuary. It was a ritual of controlled information and projected authority. He stood before a bank of monitors displaying satellite imagery, drone feeds, and logistical charts. His company commanders and staff officers sat in neat rows, a captive audience to his gravelly-voiced assessments. Captain Rostova stood in the back, near the flap of the tent, a silent observer in a room full of performers. Thorne was outlining patrol schedules when his gaze drifted over the logistical data on the screen. He paused, a theatrical beat, and a thin smile touched his lips. "And let's make sure S4 is keeping an accurate count this week," he said, his eyes flicking to the back of the room for a fraction of a second. "I'd hate to run out of MREs and have to eat the damn PowerPoint slides. We need our people in the rear to be as sharp as our people on the line." A few sycophantic chuckles rippled through the tent. It was a direct shot, wrapped in the guise of a general statement. Rostova's expression remained unchanged. She simply made a small note on the datapad she held. Her stillness seemed to irritate Thorne more than any retort would have. He saw a compliant paper pusher, not a professional officer absorbing information. He finished the briefing with a series of curt orders and dismissed them. As the officers filed out, Rostova lingered, studying the patrol routes overlaid on the topographical map. She noticed a subtle but consistent pattern. Patrols favored the easier, more direct paths through the wadis, leaving the higher, more difficult ridge lines to drone surveillance. It was efficient, but predictable. Later that day, near the mess hall, the confrontation Thorne's attitude had implicitly sanctioned finally occurred. Sergeant Tremblay, the same swaggering NCO who had watched her arrival, blocked her path. He was flanked by two of his corporals, their bulk creating a wall of muscle and bravado. "Evening, ma'am." Tremblay said, the honorific dripping with sarcasm. "Welcome to the sandbox. See, you're still getting your bearings." "Sergeant," Rostova replied, her tone neutral. Her eyes weren't on him, but on his two subordinates, gauging their posture, their commitment to this foolishness. Tremblay's smirk widened. He pointed a thumb at a small, black square patch on the left shoulder of her flak vest. It was a simple piece of fabric held on by Velcro with no markings. In a world of colorful unit patches and morale slogans, its plainness was an anomaly. "What's this supposed to be? You mourning something? Or just too lazy to get a real patch?" "It's a patch cover, Sergeant." "A cover?" He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Covering what?" "The big OL logo for the POG of the Month Club." His cronies snickered. "You know, around here, we have a tradition. Unidentified patches are contraband." His hand shot out, fast and aggressive, aiming to rip the black square from her vest. Rostova moved with an almost imperceptible shift of her weight. She didn't step back. She pivoted on the ball of her right foot, rotating her body a mere 30 degrees. Tremblay's grasping fingers, expecting to meet a solid surface, instead slid across the cordura fabric of her vest, finding no purchase. His momentum carried him slightly off balance. For a heartbeat, the three Marines stared. It hadn't been a block or a parry. It was something else, an effortless redirection, a movement so fluid it seemed she hadn't moved at all. The air crackled with a new tension. The game had suddenly changed. Rostova's gaze finally locked onto Tremblay's. Her eyes were flat, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The quiet challenge hung in the air. Tremblay, recovering his composure, felt a flush of embarrassment and anger. He had been made to look clumsy without being touched. "Whatever," he spat, trying to reclaim his authority. "Just watch yourself, Captain." He and his men stepped aside, their bravado deflated. As Rostova walked away, Lance Corporal Davies, one of the onlookers who wasn't in Tremblay's clique, watched her go. He'd seen the movement. It wasn't the stiff, practiced H2 H-taught in basic training. It was something else entirely. It was like watching a predator twitch, a brief glimpse of the coiled muscle beneath the skin. The new Loggy captain, he realized, was not what she seemed. In the days that followed, Captain Rostova became a quiet enigma. She performed her duties in the S4 depot with meticulous efficiency. Inventories were reconciled, requisitions were streamlined, and for the first time in months, the flow of supplies from the flight line to the frontline units was seamless. Captain Jensen, her nominal superior, was baffled and delighted. He saw a gifted administrator and left her to her work. But her real work began after she signed off on the last supply manifest of the day. She didn't retreat to the sparse comfort of the officers' quarters. Instead, she walked the FOB. Her path was not random. It was a series of methodical inspections. She spent an hour in the motor pool, not talking to the mechanics, but observing. She watched how they triaged damaged vehicles returning from patrol, noting the recurring vulnerabilities in the MRAP's suspension systems when exposed to the fine, abrasive dust. She ran a diagnostic on a supposedly functional but neglected ground-penetrating radar unit, discovering a calibration drift that made it 30% less effective at detecting buried IEDs. She logged the finding in a maintenance request that was promptly ignored by everyone but a junior maintenance tech who was intrigued by her specificity. Her attention then turned to the FOB's perimeter defenses. She walked the entire fence line, a 3-mile loop, at the same pace, her eyes constantly scanning. She wasn't looking at the concertina wire or the HESCOs. She was looking beyond them. She studied the interlocking fields of fire from the guard towers, noting a blind spot where a shallow, eroded wadi offered a covered approach to the western wall. The fixed thermal cameras covering that sector were angled slightly too high, creating a shadow of dead space nearly 50 meters long. It was during one of these walks that Lance Corporal Davies and his friend, PFC Chun, saw her again. They were on guard duty in Tower 4, overlooking that same western perimeter. "There she is again," Chun said, pointing with his chin. "Captain Logistics. What do you think she's looking for?" "A missing box of staples." Davies didn't laugh. He watched Rostova through his binoculars. She wasn't just looking, she was calculating. Her head tilted as she tracked the sun's angle, her gaze lingering on the shadows cast by the rocky outcrops outside the wire. I don't know, man. Remember what happened with Tremblay? She moves differently. Yeah, maybe she took a judo class on the weekends. Chan scoffed, but his eyes stayed on her. Rostova's final stop was the comms tent. She didn't interfere, but she observed the technicians at work. She noticed a persistent, low-level signal degradation on the primary satellite uplink. The comms officer had dismissed it as atmospheric interference, common in the region. But Rostova saw a pattern. The latency spikes occurred at regular, predictable intervals. It wasn't random noise. It was systematic, almost deliberate, like a faint, rhythmic jamming signal that was too weak to trip the alarms but strong enough to subtly corrupt data packets. It was a ghost in the machine that everyone else had learned to live with. She never spoke of her findings to Colonel Thorne or the other senior officers. She logged the maintenance issues through official channels and made notes on her datapad. To them, she was an eccentric bureaucrat, obsessing over details that were beneath the commander's concern. But to Rostova, these details were everything. They were loose threads in the fabric of the FOB's security. And she knew that when the pressure came, it was always the loose threads that unraveled first. The sky began to change on a Tuesday afternoon. The usual brilliant, merciless blue bleached to a hazy, jaundiced yellow at the horizon. The wind, once a steady, hot breath, began to gust in violent, unpredictable fits, whipping sand into stinging projectiles. The old hands called it a hubbub, a wall of dust that could swallow the sun and turn day into a suffocating twilight. The forecast models on the Weather Channel and the command tent showed a storm of historic proportions, a swirling mass of red and purple bearing down on their valley. Colonel Thorne, for all his bluster, was a competent commander. He issued the standard storm protocols. Secure all loose equipment. Double the guards on the perimeter. Prepare for power fluctuations. His orders were sound, conventional, and entirely inadequate for what was coming. The first intelligence report came in just as the leading edge of the storm hit, the sky darkening with terrifying speed. A drone, struggling against the gale-force winds before its sensors failed, had captured a brief image, dozens of technicals and dismounted fighters massing in a Canyon 5 clicks to the north. It was the largest insurgent force seen in the sector in over a year. They're going to use the storm as cover, Thorne stated, his voice tight. A full-scale assault. They think they can walk right up to the wire while we're blind and deaf. His words were prophetic. As the wind rose to a deafening shriek, the FOB's electronic nervous system began to fail. The perimeter sensors, battered by sand and debris, screamed a constant stream of false positives until the operators had no choice but to mute them, rendering them useless. The drone feeds winked out one by one, their cameras blinded by the impenetrable curtain of dust. Then the comms began to die. The very signal degradation Rostova had noted went from a minor annoyance to a catastrophic failure. The low-level interference, amplified by the atmospheric chaos of the storm, was now powerful enough to sever the link. "Sir, I've lost the primary satellite uplink," the comms officer, a young lieutenant, shouted over the roar of the wind against the tent fabric. "The whole network is going down. I can't get a clear signal to regional command." Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle the air in the command tent. Thorne's face was a grim mask, illuminated by the red flashing lights of the failing equipment. He was cut off, blind, and commanding an island in the middle of a hurricane, with a wolf pack circling just beyond the shore. He barked orders to switch to high-frequency radio, to try backup channels, his voice straining to maintain control as his technological advantages were stripped away. "Give me a line to the air wing. I want every asset we have on standby," he yelled. "Can't, sir. All channels are static." The first explosions rocked the FOB from the west. The deep, guttural crump of RPGs and the chatter of heavy machine guns joined the symphony of the storm. The attack had begun. The insurgents were using the Wadi, the very approach Rostova had identified as a vulnerability. The command tent, once the brain of the operation, was now a disconnected echo chamber, filled with the shouts of men who could only guess at the battle raging just a few hundred yards away. Thorne slammed his fist on the map table, his knuckles white. They were fighting in the dark, and the night had just begun. The command tent was a vortex of controlled chaos. Men shouted into dead handsets while Colonel Thorne stared at a tactical map that was no longer receiving real-time updates, effectively a useless piece of paper. The air was thick with the smell of ozone from frying electronics and the bitter tang of fear. The battle outside was a terrifying, disembodied roar. They were fighting blind, a heavy weight flailing in the dark. Amid the rising panic, Captain Eva Rostova moved. She didn't run or shout. She moved with a serene, deliberate purpose that was utterly at odds with her surroundings. No one noticed her at first as she slipped past the frantic comms lieutenant and sat at a secondary signals intelligence terminal, a dusty piece of equipment relegated to monitoring background chatter. Her fingers, which most had only seen signing supply forms, danced across the keyboard. They didn't just type, they flew with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. She wasn't using the standard graphic interface. Her screen was a cascade of green text, command lines, and scrolling code. She was deep in the machine's guts, rewriting its rules on the fly. Thorne, turning in frustration, finally saw her. "Captain, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Get out of the way." Rostova didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, her focus absolute. "The primary uplink is compromised, sir. They're using a sophisticated jammer, timed to peak with the storm's atmospheric distortion. Trying to force a connection through it is useless." The comms lieutenant scoffed. "She's right about that, but there's no other way. The backup channels are gone." Rostova's fingers paused for a fraction of a second. "There's always another way." She initiated a sequence of commands that made the lieutenant's eyes go wide. She was bypassing the military satellite network entirely. With a few lines of code, she piggybacked a signal onto a commercial broadcast satellite used by a European news agency, a highly illegal and technically audacious move. The signal was weak, but it was a start. From there, she began daisy chaining, hopping her encrypted data packet through a series of obscure civilian and scientific relays, a weather satellite over the Indian Ocean, a deep space communications array in Australia, a defunct telecommunications satellite still in a decaying orbit. She was building a new highway in the sky, piece by piece, routing around the storm and the jamming signal. It was a feat of digital improvisation that should have taken a team of specialists hours, if not days. She did it in 90 seconds. The screen in front of her flashed a single word, connection_stable. She stood, picked up a standard radio handset from a dead console, and plugged its cord into her terminal. She held it out to the stunned comms lieutenant. Her voice was calm, cutting through the din. "You're live. Encrypted burst transmission. 1.5-second latency. Tell Regional Command FOB Kestrel is under sustained attack and request immediate drone and air support. Coordinates to follow." The tent fell silent. The only sounds were the storm, the battle, and the faint, clear crackle of a live comms channel in the lieutenant's hand. He stared at the handset as if it were a holy relic, then looked at Rostova, his mouth agape. Colonel Thorne stared at her too, his mind struggling to reconcile the quiet logistics captain with a woman who had just single-handedly rebuilt his entire communication network from scrap. Rostova simply stepped back, her part played, and turned her attention to the tactical map, her expression as unreadable as ever. The atmosphere in the command tent had undergone a profound chemical change. The frantic edge of panic was gone, replaced by a stunned, focused silence. The comms lieutenant was now speaking in clipped, professional tones, relaying information to a regional command that had, moments before, believed them to be lost. The tide hadn't turned, but a door had been opened in the darkness, and the light flooding in came from the most unexpected source. Every eye not fixed on a screen was now on Captain Rostova. They watched her as she moved to the main tactical display, the one Thorne had been staring at uselessly. She tapped a command into a side terminal, and the static-filled map flickered. It was still blind to their immediate surroundings, but new data began to populate the screen. Topographical overlays pulled from archived files, weather patterns pulled from the civilian satellite she had commandeered. She was building a new picture of the battlefield from disparate, forgotten sources. Colonel Thorne walked to her side, his movements stiff. He no longer saw a bean counter. He saw a weapon of unknown origin and capability, and he had no idea how to wield it. "Report, Captain," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. It was a simple, direct order. A question. "The enemy is exploiting the wadi on the western perimeter, sir," Rostova said, pointing to the map. The confirmation of this came crackling over the newly established radio net. Sergeant Tremblay's voice, strained with fear and exertion, was calling for reinforcements. "Under heavy fire at checkpoint 3. They're using the dead ground in the gully. We can't get a clear shot. We're about to be overrun." Thorne's eyes flicked from the map to Rostova. It was the exact blind spot she had been observed studying for days. Coincidence was no longer a viable explanation. The gears of his rigid, conventional worldview were grinding, trying to process an impossible reality. This woman hadn't just predicted the attack. She had understood it on a granular level he hadn't thought possible for anyone outside his own infantry cadre. Lance Corporal Davies, who had been tasked with running messages between the command tent and the aid station, stood near the entrance, transfixed. He saw the looks on the faces of the senior officers. He saw the awe on the comms lieutenant's face. And he saw Rostova, calm as a statue in the heart of the storm, pointing at a map and speaking with an authority that had nothing to do with the silver bar on her collar. It was the authority of pure, undeniable competence. PFC Chen joined him, his face pale. "Did you hear? The whole comms grid was down. She fixed it. They're saying I don't know, hacked a satellite or something." "I told you she was different," Davies whispered, his gaze locked on Rostova. The respect was not yet universal, but a seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of everyone in that tent. The assumptions they had made about her, the easy dismissals and casual insults, now seemed like the ignorant posturing of children. They had been judging a person's skill by the label on their uniform, and they had been catastrophically, dangerously wrong. The question was no longer who she was, but what she was. "They've breached the wire at Sector West." The report came over the radio, laced with a metallic taste of panic. "I have 2 men down, and Fire Team Bravo is pinned down outside the concertina. We need support now." Sergeant Tremblay's squad was collapsing. The insurgents, using the storm and the terrain with brutal efficiency, had established a foothold inside the FOB's perimeter. The battle had reached its tipping point. Air support was still 10 minutes out and would be flying blind in the hubbub. The quick reaction force was bogged down, unable to advance against the heavy machine gun fire pouring from the captured section of the wall. Colonel Thorne's options had dwindled to zero. He had men, he had guns, but he had no solution. He was staring at a tactical problem he couldn't solve, and his Marines were dying because of it. Into this desperate silence, Rostova stepped forward. She didn't wait to be asked. She didn't request permission. She acted. She pointed to a section of the digital map just outside the breached wire, an area that sensors and visual checks showed as empty desert. "Their command element is here," she stated, her voice cutting through the tension. "They're coordinating the attack from that position." The operations officer shook his head. "Captain, that's negative. That area is clear. We have it under observation." "You're observing with standard thermal imagers," Rostova countered, her tone flat and certain. "They're using third-generation thermal baffling blankets. They reflect the ambient ground temperature, rendering them invisible to passive IR. They're hiding in plain sight." Thorne stared at her, his mind racing. It was an advanced piece of equipment, something you'd expect from a state-sponsored actor, not a regional insurgency. "How can you be sure?" "Their comms discipline is too good for them to be operating independently," she explained, her logic cold and swift. "The attack is coordinated. The command element has to be close to the breach point. That is the only tactically sound location." She then gave the order that would change everything. Have the mortars fire illumination rounds, not standard flares. Strobes. Tell Tower 3 to floodlight that entire grid square with high-intensity infrared spotlights on a 7-second pulse frequency. A confused murmur went through the staff. IR strobes? The operations officer asked. Ma'am, that will blind our own people. Their night vision will be useless. Their NVDs will be overwhelmed, Rostova corrected impatiently. It will be like staring into a strobe light in a dark room. But our optics, the ones in the crow's gun stations and the sniper scopes, can filter the frequency. We set them to a narrow bandpass filter. We'll be able to see through the glare. They won't. It was an obscure, high-risk countermeasure from a deep-level electronic warfare playbook. It was brilliant, and it was their only chance. Thorn was a man on a cliff's edge. Behind him was the certainty of defeat. Before him was a leap of faith, guided by a woman he had dismissed as a clerk. He looked at her, at the absolute certainty in her eyes, and made his decision. Do it, he barked into the radio. Mortars, fire IR Ilum on grid, Delta 79er. Tower 3, lighted up with IR strobes, 7-second pulse. All Crow stations set optics to narrow bandpass filter, code word Spectre execute now. The orders were relayed. A moment later, the sky outside the command tent, already a maelstrom of brown dust, was lit by a series of silent, pulsing flashes of invisible light. On the western perimeter, for the Marines equipped with standard night vision, the world turned into a blinding, disorienting flicker. But for the gunners in the remote weapon stations, the view through their scopes became crystal clear. And there, in the middle of the empty patch of desert, were 8 figures, previously invisible, now writhing in confusion, clutching at their useless night vision goggles. One was clearly on a radio, directing the attack. The command element. Weapons free on grid, Delta 79er, Thorn commanded, his voice filled with a cold fury. Engage the heavy machine guns on the FOB's walls, guided by perfect targeting data, opened up. The insurgent attack, its brains suddenly and violently severed, faltered, collapsed, and then broke into a full-blown retreat. Fire Team Bravo was recovered, and the breach was sealed. The battle was over. As the storm abated, a fragile quiet descended upon FOB Kestrel. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh, and the dust began to settle, revealing the scars of the night's battle. The command tent was still, the adrenaline giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion and a lingering sense of awe. The crisis had passed, but the questions had just begun. Colonel Thorn stood amidst the debris of his own certainty. He walked over to Captain Rostova, who was methodically cleaning a dust filter on a piece of communications gear. Her focus is intense on this mundane task, as it had been on saving his command. He stopped before her, the difference in their height and rank suddenly meaningless. Captain, he began, his voice rough. The IR strobe tactic. The satellite workaround. The thermal baffling. That isn't in any logistics training manual I've ever seen. Where did you learn it? Rostova looked up from her work. Her flak vest was scuffed, and a corner of the plain black patch on her shoulder had been torn loose during the chaos, likely snagged on a piece of equipment. The threadbare corner flapped slightly, revealing a small glimpse of what lay beneath. A smaller, subdued patch, embroidered not with a symbol, but with a simple string of numbers in muted gray thread. She reached up to press it back down, but Thorn's eyes had already fixed on it. He squinted, tried to read the designation. 734, he read aloud, the number sounding alien in the quiet tent. It meant nothing to him, but it meant everything to the young comms lieutenant who had been standing nearby, listening. His specialty wasn't just maintaining radios. It was signals intelligence and military history. His face went white, the blood draining from it as if he'd seen a ghost. He took a hesitant step forward. Sir, he whispered, his voice trembling. Unit 734. Thorn turned to him, annoyed. What is it, Lieutenant? Spit it out. That's a legacy designation, sir. It hasn't been active in years. Officially, it never existed. The lieutenant swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Thorn and Rostova, who had now gone perfectly still. They called it Task Force Nomad. Unofficially, they called them the Ghosts Deep Reconnaissance, Direct Action, Special Missions in Electronically Denied Environments. They wrote the book on the kind of warfare we just faced. They were a legend, a myth. I thought it was just a story they told at spy school. The entire command staff had now turned to listen, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. A logistics captain. It was the perfect cover, a place so mundane, so far removed from the world of shadows and whispers, that no one would ever think to look. She hadn't been counting beans. She had been observing, analyzing, and waiting. Thorn turned back to Rostova. He looked at her hands, clean and steady. He looked at her face, calm and unadorned. And he finally saw her. He wasn't looking at a captain in the logistics corps. He was looking at a living ghost, a master of a lethal art form he had never truly understood. The quiet woman in his command tent was, without a doubt, the most dangerous person on the entire base, and he had told her not to lose his bullets. The irony was so profound it almost made him laugh. Instead, a cold wave of humility washed over him, the first he had felt in decades. News, especially news of this magnitude, travels faster than any radio signal on a forward operating base. The story of the quiet, loggy captain who had single-handedly turned back a major assault spread from the command tent to the guard towers, from the motor pool to the mess hall. It was told in hushed, incredulous tones, the details becoming more legendary with each telling. The next afternoon, Sergeant Tremblay found her. His arm was in a sling, a piece of shrapnel having found him during the worst of the fighting at the Western Wall. His face, usually a mask of arrogant confidence, was pale and etched with a deep, unfamiliar shame. He was flanked by the same 2 corporals who had been with him during the confrontation and a dozen other Marines from his squad, the men whose lives she had saved. They found her not in the command tent, but outside the S-4 depot, overseeing the unloading of a pallet of water bottles. She was back to her official job, her focus on the mundane task absolute. When she saw them approach, she paused, her expression giving nothing away. Tremblay and his men stopped a respectful 10 feet away. The sergeant opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. An apology felt cheap, inadequate. Excuses were impossible. There was nothing he could say to bridge the chasm between his ignorance and her reality. So he did the only thing he could. He straightened his back, clicked his heels together, and brought his hand up in the sharpest, most ferociously precise salute of his life. It was not the perfunctory gesture offered to a passing officer. It was an act of fealty, a silent, profound admission of error, and a demonstration of boundless respect. One by one, the Marines behind him did the same. Their arms snapped up, their bodies rigid, their eyes locked on the unassuming captain. Then, something remarkable happened. A Marine walking by saw the formation and stopped, his curiosity turning to understanding as he recognized Rostova. He too saluted. Then another, and another. It spread like a wave across the dusty compound. Lance Corporal Davies and PFC Chun, coming off guard duty, saw the gathering and immediately rendered honors. The mechanics in the motor pool wiped the grease from their hands and stood at attention. Even Captain Jensen, her S-4 superior, emerged from the depot and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. Finally, Colonel Thorne stepped out of the command tent. He saw the scene, the silent tribute being paid by dozens of his hardened Marines to the woman he had so thoroughly misjudged. He walked forward until he was part of the circle, stood before her, and rendered his own salute. It was a public and unequivocal acknowledgement of his failure and her triumph. For a long moment, Captain Eva Rostova stood in the center of a sea of salutes, the focus of the entire base's respect. The silence was absolute, broken only by the flapping of the flag on the central pole. Captain Rostova held their gaze for a moment, her own eyes sweeping across the faces before her. Tremblay's shame, Davies' awe, Thorne's hard-won respect. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a quiet, solemn acceptance. She returned the salute, a single, clean gesture that encompassed every one of them, from the colonel to the lowest private. Then she lowered her hand. The moment held for another second before Colonel Thorne dropped his own salute, a signal to the others. Slowly, like a tide receding, the salutes fell, and the Marines, one by one, turned and went back to their duties. The spectacle was over. The point had been made, not with words, but with the silent, universal language of the military. Rostova watched them go. She then turned back to the pallet of water bottles, but her eyes fell on the torn corner of the black patch on her shoulder. The gray numbers, 734, were still visible, a small tear in the fabric of her meticulously crafted cover. She walked to a small supply locker and retrieved a field sewing kit. Sitting on an empty crate, with the setting sun casting long shadows across the FOB, she began to repair the patch. Her movements were as precise and economical with a needle and thread as they had been on a keyboard or a tactical map. Each stitch was perfect, pulling the black fabric back over the secret it concealed. She wasn't hiding from her past. She was simply putting it away. The ghosts were a myth for a reason. Their power lay in their anonymity, in their ability to be unseen and underestimated. Her role here was not to be a legend. It was to be Captain Rostova, logistics officer. The respect she had earned was a powerful, invisible armor, far more effective than any rank or reputation. But her work required her to blend back into the background, to become once more a part of the machinery. The final image of her at FOB Kestrel, for those who happened to see it, was not of the comms wizard or the tactical genius. It was of a quiet captain, sitting alone, her head bent in concentration, performing the simple, mundane task of mending her own uniform. The dust, stirred by the day's activity, settled around her, and a new, unspoken order settled with it. Competence was the only currency that truly mattered, and she had paid in full. The needle dipped and rose, pulling the last thread tight, sealing the ghost back in its shell, ready for the next time it was needed.